In this video, I want to look at one of the updates to the ESV text that was made in 2016. And it's specifically this Genesis 3:16 verse here that I want to look at, because some people have really taken issue with this change that they made. And I want to look at in this video, was this a legitimate change? Was this a good update to the text? So originally in the previous editions, Genesis 3:16 read, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." In the updated text, it says, "Your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." So you can see there is a change there that is pretty significant in the way you might understand this verse. So one of the reasons people, I think, might be taking issue with this is because the updated edition is a little bit of a less literal rendering of this verse, whereas the previous edition, you kind of maintain the ambiguity of the original verse. It's a little bit hard to tell exactly what that word desire means when it says, "Your desire shall be for your husband," whereas clearly here they're saying your desire shall be contrary to your husband. So yes, this update you could argue is a little bit less literal. And I want to look at some information just to kind of see, is this a legitimate way to translate this verse? I think when something isn't very clear in the text, sometimes it's good to pull away from being maybe overly literal and try to clarify exactly what is meant by the terms that are used, because the original hearers probably would have understood what these terms were actually getting at, whereas in English it might be a little bit harder to discern. So we'll look at that, but I wanted to point out a couple of reasons why people might have a problem. One is it is less literal. The other reason people might have a problem with this is because I think a lot of people can be a bit suspicious of the English Standard Version and its ties to complementarianism. I think a lot of people would perceive the English Standard Version as being more associated with people who hold to a complementarian position. And so when they see a verse like this change, they think maybe there's an agenda here, because before it said, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Now that you're getting into almost a theological understanding of this, where you actually have a battle going on between the woman and the man, that your desire shall be contrary to your husband, he shall rule over you. Notice, though, a very similar verse, the next verse here, Genesis 4:7, that's listed. It's talking about sin here, and God is talking to Cain, and he says about sin that its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Now that's how the previous editions read. Now the ESV in 2016 was updated in this passage as well in a very similar way. And I think if you look at the original language, you can see there's a lot of similarity between these two passages and their phrasing. So now the updated text reads that sin's desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So is there really an agenda, like a complementarian agenda going on here, where they're trying to really make a theological point about the dissension between men and women compared to how the text originally read? Well, let's look at some other translations, and I love to do this just to see how other translations render phrases. And you notice the NASB 95 said, "Your desire will be for your husband," which is a pretty literal rendering, how the ESV used to read, "and he will rule over you." The NIV says something similar, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." The New King James Version, "Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." So you see a lot of similarity there in those translations. But notice here the New Living Translation. It says, "You will desire to control your husband, but he will rule over you." Now that's a little bit more reminiscent of what we're reading in the ESV update, "Contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you." And if anything, this is even more explicit. It's saying you will desire to control your husband, according to the New Living Translation. But a translation I really like to look at when it comes to these questions of, was this a legitimate translation, or is there maybe a nefarious agenda going on here in this particular rendering. I like to look at the NET because it will not only give you a certain rendering, but it will often explain why, if there's any controversy surrounding that rendering. So in the NET, you'll notice it says here, you will want to control your husband, but he will dominate you. So that's clearly not a highly literal rendering of this passage, but why would they say here, you will want to control your husband? Is there some sort of a theological agenda in that rendering? I don't really believe so. And I like looking at the notes in the New English Translation. I encourage you to look at the notes. If you ever have a question about why something is translated a certain way, just look it up in the NET, look at the notes, and it can be very insightful. And so you'll see here it says in the Hebrew, toward your husband will be your desire. The nominal sentence does not have a verb. That's why you have the brackets here. So it would say, toward your husband, your desire. So a future verb must be supplied because the focus of the oracle is on the future struggle. God is giving out judgment because of human sin. And so God is saying, this is what is going to be the reality from here on out. Your desire will be toward your husband. That's something that is going to be the case from here on out. The precise meaning of the noun desire is debated. Many interpreters conclude that it refers to sexual desire here because the subject of the passage is the relationship between a wife and her husband, and because the word is used in a romantic sense in Song of Solomon. However, this interpretation makes little sense in Genesis 3:16. First, it does not fit well with the assertion, he will dominate you. Second, it implies that sexual desire was not part of the original creation, even though the man and the woman were told to multiply. And third, it ignores the usage of the word in Genesis 4:7, which we looked at before, where it refers to sin's desire to control and dominate Cain. Even in Song of Songs, it carries the basic idea of control, for it describes the young man's desire to have his way sexually with the young woman. In Genesis 3:16, the Lord announces a struggle, a conflict between the man and the woman. She will desire to control him, but he will dominate her instead. This interpretation also fits the tone of the passage, which is a judgment oracle. So there is an explanation and a defense for rendering this passage, maybe in a less literal way, but a more explicit way as to what the passage is really getting at, that the woman will want to control her husband, but he will dominate her. So I think in looking at this information, this is a legitimate translation. There is a case to be made for rendering this passage the way that the ESV has rendered it. Again, you can see here, just looking at these two verses, Genesis 3:16 and 4:7, that they were actually being consistent. They changed Genesis 3:16 to have that idea of being contrary to, but they did the same thing in Genesis 4:7. So there's consistency there. I don't think they were just doing this arbitrarily. But a big point I want to make in all of this is just to have some self-reflection about our reactions to translations, because I really think that a lot of times we can be suspicious when we read a translation and we don't like the way that they rendered something, and sometimes we ascribe some sort of an ulterior motive in the way that something was rendered. But I think before you make that assumption, you really need to take a step back and look at the possible reasons for why the translators translated things the way that they did, and really try to understand where they were coming from and see if you think that they have a case to be made based on the original languages. What I'm saying is a lot of times we react to the way that a translator makes a choice about a certain passage based on our own previous understanding or our own biases, rather than really objectively saying, is this a legitimate rendering based on the original languages? Which is how we ought to approach a situation like this. The other thing that I learned from this, which I think is an important point, is that it's easy for us to kind of look at the negative side of people coming from a certain vantage point when they do Bible translation, and we can think, well, the reason that they are translating a certain way is because they're biased. One thing I will say about that, though, is that if people do have a certain leaning, while that could present bias into their translation, on the other hand, it could allow them to be more open to a possibility that is actually really there in the text, that other people who disagree with that theological understanding may not really want that to be in the text. And so sometimes our theological position is actually helpful in allowing us to be open to something that the scripture is saying and to be willing to put that in the text explicitly if we're translating. Now, that being said, I think we should try to avoid bias in Bible translation. We should try to be as objective as possible. And that's why I showed you the notes from the NET to say that while I do think there is a judgment call being made here, I think there is really a legitimate case to be made that instead of rendering this in just a plain literal way, saying that your desire shall be toward your husband, which a lot of translations do that, your desire will be for your husband. I think there's really a case to be made, like the NET says here, you will want to control your husband. Your desire, in that sense, will be to have dominancy, but instead he will dominate you. Now, does that have theological implications? Absolutely, but no matter what, this passage has some sort of theological implications. The question is, what was the original writer trying to say? What was the intent of how this passage was originally communicated? And I think it's great that we have these different translations to compare. But ultimately, what I'm saying in this video is be careful about judging when you see translators make a choice, especially if it is contrary to your biases and what you would prefer the text say. Because it's easy for us to react emotionally if we don't like the choice that they made. But maybe there's a correction that needs to be made to our understanding, and maybe we need to do a little bit more research into the original languages so that we can understand why the translators made the decision that they made. And again, it is possible that they have a theological perspective that is informing some of their choices, but in some cases that may actually be helpful. It may actually make them more open to what the text is actually getting at, and to be able to convey that to us clearly in our language. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful. I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comment section below. Did you have a problem with the update to Genesis 3:16? And in looking at all of this information, do you feel a little bit more open to why they made the change that they made? Are you a little bit more accepting of it now? Or was this never a problem for you in the first place? Do you think that this was actually a good change that they made and you never had an issue with it? Also, was it interesting to you to look at the NET notes? I hope that people will take away from a video like this the advantage and the opportunities that you have in using notes from the NET translation. I don't know how many of you do that. Do you use the NET notes a lot? I'd love to hear that in the comment section as well. But thank you so much for taking a look at this update of the ESV in this particular verse and listening to some of my thoughts on it from a Frisch perspective.